Now let me move on and take time to cover two main objections that Van Til addressed in his defense of the faith, where Van Til was aware that some had charged him with holding to some species of absolute idealism. Now, I want to survey these and not develop them in any long or sustained way. The first one is going to be found in the Defense of the Faith, pages 228 and 232. And I am going to simply state that Van Til state the position as crisply as I know how, and then move on to the second one. First, he deals with the God of idealism. And I think I'm just going to summarize the nature of his response from page 228 to 232. And the quickest way I know how to do so is that Van Til makes clear that the most central distinction in his system, I'm just going to put it over here, is the doctrine of the ontological Trinity on the one side, and the doctrine of temporal creation on the other side. Without getting into the details on pages 228 through 232, he's simply saying this: over against the idealist position, which we've now surveyed. Quote, before the world was, God existed from all eternity as a self-conscious and self-sufficient being. And from the Christian point of view, it's impossible to think of the non-existence of God, but it is very well possible to think of the non-existence of the world. In fact, we believe the world once upon a time did not exist. It was created by God out of nothing. End of quote. Now, what is so important about this? Van Til's affirming two key things here, and I just want to highlight them by way of responding to objection. The first one is that God remains self-sufficient and self-conscious as creator. Do you remember what Hegel said? Hegel said that if that were the case, God could know nothing, because the very essence of thought is to have objects emerging in its developmental experience. So by Van Til affirming that God from all eternity is and remains a self-conscious and self-sufficient being is the death of Hegel's view of the absolute. And secondly, he not only affirms temporal creation, but he affirms temporal creation ex nihilo. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that the absolute and the contingent created are not reciprocally related and interdependent in either being or knowledge. Temporal creation, creation out of nothing, is the very antithesis of Hegel's developmental correlativism, Hegel's developmental pantheism. And so Van Til sums up the matter by saying that God and man must be thought as correlatives to one another in idealism, but in Christianity, we have an immutable God and a doctrine of temporal creation. And so Van Til, from pages 228 to 232 of the Defense of the Faith, simply reasserts the two features that destroy idealism: the ontological Trinity, temporal creation out of nothing. Now there's one more, kind of more important criticism, Orlebeke's difficulty, Van Til calls it. And this is an important section. I'm going to take a little bit more time to do this, but from roughly pages 232 through 234, Van Til deals with an objection that he says does require some explanation. I'm going to read some fairly large portions of this section. I know you can read along, but I need to make you aware of it. Van Til says, there is one form of expression which by itself, in isolation, might sound like idealism. I have said that God's interpretation, his thought, precedes and is constructive or constitutive of facts. Orlebeke says this raises a question. The question is this: what relation obtains between the knowledge of God and the being of created facts? Orthodox Christianity has maintained that the cosmos came into existence by virtue of a divine creative act, and that this existence is continuously maintained by divine power. It is also held that God has a comprehensive plan for history, and that every event occurs according to his will in conformity with that plan. Further, God necessarily knows comprehensively and exhaustively every fact, whether past, present, or future. In harmony with these facts, Professor Van Til says, Scripture teaches that every fact in the universe exists and operates by virtue of the plan of God. There are no brute facts for God. As to his own being, fact and interpretation are coextensive. As to the universe, God's interpretation logically precedes the denotation and connotation of all the facts of which it consists. But Orlebeke goes on to say, somewhat more radical, however, is a later assertion that, quote, for Christianity, he's now quoting Van Til, God's thought is constitutive. By God's thoughts do the facts of the universe come into existence, end of quote. Orlebeke goes on, there lurks here a curious ambiguity. It is one thing to say God's thought logically precedes facts, and another thing to say that God's thoughts enter into the being of facts. Are we to understand that the knowledge of God cannot be distinguished from the objects of that knowledge? If it is possible to say that God's thought is constitutive of facts, is it not also necessary to say that the facts are constitutive of God's knowledge and therefore of God? In other words, now, end of quote. In other words, the criticism is this: if God's thoughts are constitutive of facts, and God's being enters into the facts because God's thought and being are coterminous, then isn't it the case that God's thought constitutes the fact, yet the fact constitutes God's thought in a relation of mutual determination? Well, we've already seen, I think this is fair, in light of this entire Reformed Forum Academy treatment of Van Til's work, that cannot possibly be what Van Til means when he speaks in this way. Van Til, more robustly than any other theologian in the 20th century, denied God's being or God's knowledge is correlative with the world. Now, what does Van Til say in response to this? He says this, quote, the following remarks can here be made. The doctrine of temporal creation permeates the syllabus on Christian theistic evidences from which Orlebeke quotes no less than it does the other syllabi. And the creation is the fulfillment of God's plan. I've argued against Spinoza, who argues for the identity of knowledge and being. I've argued against Kant, for whom the being of facts are known independently, are known and as organized by the constructive or constitutive activity of the mind of man assumed to be autonomous. I've argued against the idealists, for whom God and the universe are correlative. I've argued against other schools of philosophy, classic realism among them, always on the ground that they deny the self-existent God and temporal creation, thus making the universe constitutive of God as much as God constitutive of the universe. In the immediate context of Orlebeke's quotation, my argument deals with the current scientific ideal as influenced by Kant's notion of limiting being. It's difficult to think of a greater contrast than between this Kantian limiting concept and the notion of God as the constitutive creator and interpreter of the facts of the universe. The latter thinks of God as self-determinative and man-determinative. The former thinks of man as self-determinative and God-determinative. The latter interprets reality in terms of God. The former interprets reality in terms of man. End of quote. What is Van Til saying? He's saying that for the Reformed, God as the triune creator constitutes the facts and the meaning of those facts in the world of experience. And he's saying that for Kant, the human mind constitutes the intelligibility and rationality of the facts. Van Til's intention in speaking the way he spoke is to lay the axe to the root of Kantian idealism, which we've already surveyed. But then Van Til goes on to say precisely what he intends his language to mean. And I want to quote this from page 232 to 234. He says, "When I say that by God's thoughts do the facts of the universe come into existence, I mean the same as when I say that by God's plan they come into existence. God's thought or plan about the world is brought to execution by creation and providence. The things that are what they are by virtue of God's plan, realized in creation and providence. God's thought is in this sense constitutive of the facts of the universe. In view of the fact that the argument of the entire syllabus is against every form of correlativism, it would seem reasonable that my words about the constitutive character of God's thought in relation to created fact be interpreted as expressing the ideas, the doctrines of creation and providence." End of quote. So Van Til's response here is that when he speaks of God's thoughts, he means by that God's plan realized in creation and providence. Why does he use God's thoughts? To set it in antithetical contrast to Kantian constructivist epistemology, where the thoughts or understanding of man constitute the intelligibility of facts. The last thing Van Til wants to do is state or imply that God and the facts are correlative, that God's knowledge enters into the being of facts, or that God and the facts that he knows are mutually constitutive of one another. Van Til makes explicit the entire argument of the syllabus from which Orlebeke quotes is against every form of correlativism. This includes Plato, Kant, Spinoza, Hegel, Bradley, Bosanquet, Bowman, or any other advocate of any other species of correlativism. Van Til's most basic and profound critique of idealism is that correlativism is the internal ground for construing thought as constitutive of objects in a mutual process of development over time. These two responses, then, have helped us see that Van Til opposed Hegelian idealism, absolute idealism, as militantly and relentlessly as he opposed Kantian transcendental idealism. What I want us to do now, as a kind of capstone observation, is to review a summary of Van Til's doctoral dissertation, God in the Absolute. And the capstone expression of the argument is that all forms of idealism, in Van Til's estimate, reduce to pragmatism, so that both idealism and pragmatism are foes of Christianity.